Welcome to the Insomnia Project. Sit back, relax, and listen as we have a conversation about the mundane. One thing that we try to do is bring a conversation to you, our listeners, that's less than fascinating so that you can just feel free to drift off, chill, and just enjoy. Thank you for joining us. We hope that you will listen and sleep. I'm your host, Marco Timpano, and joining me today is a dear friend of mine, Jim Kim. Welcome to the Insomnia Project, Jim.
Thank you for having me. I'm happy to be here yet again.
Jim, I'm so glad to have you. One, because you're a dear friend of mine, but also because when we started the Insomnia Project as a exhibit at the Nuit Blanche, which is a 24-hour art festival, you were such a key player in that experience because Jim is my technical expert. Is a technical expert who I often rely on for my technical needs. But you helped make that art installation available to everyone through you tell me.
We basically had to MacGyver a solution. So we had a software platform, but then we also had to be able to broadcast this live, which was part of the exhibit.
And so it was kind of the precursor. It was because of that we started a podcast because you helped to take what we were doing as an art installation and broadcast it. Now you did it live.
Yes.
And then we're like, how can we do this? And we're like, podcast. But anyways, I cut you off. You were saying something.
No, that was pretty much it. And I think I was there more as soon as everything was set up. You just sort of hope and pray that everything goes smoothly.
Right.
But I was I lived across the street at the time. So I think at one point something did go wrong and I got a frantic text message. And so I just, ran back across the street and fixed it. And then that was it. And then it was hard because the one thing with Nuit Blanche is you are going all the way through the night and you had guests coming in and so it was great to see, but also with the Insomnia Project, it's effective. Right. So it's hard to stay awake throughout the night.
Sure.
And so here I am trying to stay awake to make sure everything goes smoothly, but at the same time listening to the stream and dozing off.
Right.
So
because it was 12 hours, right? It started at sundown till sunrise. Mm-hmm. Jim is at his home the entire time listening, not seeing the franticness that's going on behind the scenes, other than when something wasn't going right.
Yep.
And so you were just dozing off.
Yeah.
That's hilarious. And you played a vital role because we had all this food donated to us. And at a certain point, we're like, we've got all this food. And we're like, where are we going to store it? And we're like, Jim Kim's house. So we brought this food that was sort of contributed to our installation. And it was at your place. And people would go to your house when they needed a drink or some moments of repose, you know what I mean?
And it was a great installation as well. I remember going and the hotel was very generous and just allowed people to come in and sit and sleep in the lobby.
Yeah, people would fall asleep. I don't think the hotel realized when we sort of pitched, we got this hotel and they were happy to be a venue for an exhibit, but they didn't know what they were going to get.
Yeah,
and we were thrilled to get them. And they just thought they would have some visual art displayed and people would come into their lobby. Meanwhile, they had this group of people recording and broadcasting and people falling asleep in their lobby. And at a certain point, they were like, well, there's nothing we can do. They were really cool about it, though.
Yeah.
It's the Hotel Saint-Germain in Toronto. If you're ever looking for a hotel, tell them the Insomnia Project sent you. Speaking of your home, so you are no longer in that location. There was a condo across the street.
Correct.
Now you're in your own home, and you've got a home in a beautiful town in Ontario called St. Catharines.
Yes. It's one of the few places where someone can buy a house for under $1 million.
Right.
And I think that was a big thing. And I'm not ashamed to say that I paid $250,000.
Oh, that's amazing.
For a detached 3-bedroom house.
Oh, it's detached.
Yeah.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah, and that was something that I learned as well, being in the market. One of my friends helped me out, and I didn't realize that there's a value to having a detached house rather than a semi-detached or a row house.
For sure.
For me, at the time, a house is a house, property is property. Right. But he's like, no, if you have and then of course after this, I read an article about somebody who had a terrible neighbor in a semi-detached house, and they left their place in disrepair, and so raccoons were getting in
Oh, wow.
from their neighbor's house into
Sure.
their house. And so I was like, all right, I do need a detached house.
We should also mention that these are, when we talk about prices, these are prices for Toronto. So if you live in the city of Toronto, like many major metropolitan cities, you're not going to find a home for less, especially a detached home, for less than $1 million.
Yeah.
And St. Catharines is between Toronto and Niagara Falls, I would
Yep.
say.
It's about an hour and 20 minutes driving.
There you go.
And they're going to be, they're supposed to be installing a train from, a GO train is supposed to extend to Niagara Falls eventually. And so then it'll be an hour on the train to Toronto.
Yeah, and it's a beautiful city or town, whatever it's considered. A lot of the growing area is around St. Catharines. A lot of our growing belt or whatever, a lot of orchards and whatnot, if I'm not mistaken, are not far from there.
I think you're correct. I don't know much about the city.
Okay.
I go there, periodically right now, but it seems to be a nice place. It has its nice and terrible areas, just like anywhere else.
Sure.
But yeah, I think the price was right.
Good.
Yeah.
What was the biggest learning you received from purchasing a home that you would convey to people listening?
I think the biggest thing is there's a lot of upfront costs that you might not know about.
Right.
So there's a lawyer you have to pay for. There's property taxes, and just I think I was going in and I'm like, oh, I have a decent down payment, and that's it. Mm-hmm. The bank gives me money and I get it, and then later I find out there's at least $2,000 or $3,000 that I should have accounted for beforehand, and I was like, all right, well, now I know.
There you go.
Yeah, and that's before even trying to do any renovations. That's just so that I can take possession.
Right.
Yeah.
It's interesting. This isn't the first episode that we've done with regards to home buying and purchasing a home and dealing with the home. We have a two-parter in season 1 with Alexandra. So if our listeners are like, wow, I'm finding this interesting, I invite you to go back and listen to those. And for those of you who are just finding this calm and cool, we're going to continue to talk about home renovations, because now that home you've purchased, you've had it for what, just under a year?
Just under a year.
Okay.
About 6 months.
Okay.
6 or 7 months, yeah.
And now you're beginning to renovate the basement.
The basement, yeah.
Because I'm doing the exact same thing.
Yes.
So Jim came over and I'm like, Jim, I got to show you my basement. And so Jim is looking at it and with a really, really astute eye and saying, oh, you're doing this and you're doing that. And we're both in renovations.
Yes.
So.
Yeah. So the basement, and that was another thing, I think, was the cost of renovations.
Mm-hmm.
I grossly underestimated how much it was going to cost.
Sure.
And then even with the correct costs in place, I grossly underestimated the amount of overages that would happen. And it's not, a shady contract or anything. There were legit problems that surface once you tear things down.
It happens to everyone. Here's my thing. You gotta always sort of keep your mind in the positive. You're doing something great.
Yeah.
You're renovating your basement, your kitchen, your bathroom. Blips are gonna come up that are gonna force you to sort of figure things out, but realize that you've sort of stepped into something that is ultimately gonna be great.
Yeah.
So for us, it was the tiles. So our reno person had made a great budget. We had a great design. Jan and we're really excited. And then we're like, oh, but these aren't the tiles we want, because our rental person was like, I provide everything. I'll show you. And it was like, okay, and here are your options. And we're like, no. And then we realized we want a nicer tile that's more expensive.
Yeah.
And so it's like, oh, what do we do? What do we do? And we're like, you know what? Let's put the money in the tile, because that's something that's going to be really featured. And we'll just figure out where we can save money and not sort of spend there. So we're doing this kind of balancing act of like, okay, let's spend some here. Okay, we've come up with this. Let's save there. And whatnot. So
Are you doing any work yourself to try to save some money?
that's a great question. Now, ordinarily I would, and I have in the past, but with this particular renovation, we've decided that we're going to use contractors, just because I don't know. It seems like a project that's a little bit above what I can do, or it will just take too long for me to do it. It would take what will hopefully take 3 months to 4 months would take me a year. Just clearing out the basement, Jim, was a task in itself. So I did that. We actually had an episode where I just talk about what I found in my basement, like that microscope. Do you need a microscope?
Strangely, no, I don't.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do you need a giant cooler to cool drinks and stuff?
No.
Plates?
No, I think we're good.
Bowls?
Yeah. We're actually going the opposite way now.
Yeah.
We're downsizing. We're clearing out some stuff because of the upcoming edition.
Yes.
Yeah.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
So Jim and his wonderful wife are expecting.
Yes. This is new news to us, relatively new news to us, and now I guess new news to everybody listening. But I think when you're living in a place long enough, you barely have enough space for your own stuff. Mm-hmm. And so then when you're like, well, there's somebody else coming in, then you're realizing you have not allowed for anybody else to come in.
Right.
So you have to start clearing stuff out, and then you realize, like, I have a lot of stuff.
Sure.
Yeah.
And you have this little bundle of joy that's coming.
Yeah.
And now you've got to make space for this little bundle of joy. And you wouldn't expect a little bundle would need as much space as you're going to have to dedicate, right?
Exactly.
Because it sounds like Jim is going to be losing his office.
Yeah. I think that's the most logical way of doing it. Like we've talked about, and there's you talk about co-sleeping, I think is a thing.
Yes.
And so we've talked about that, but at the same time, like, we sleep in the basement and we like it cold. And that's probably not the best environment to raise a baby.
Right.
So, the option of putting a heater in the basement to, make it more comfortable for the baby is an option, but then it would be really uncomfortable for us.
Right.
Because we both like it cold.
I respect that. I like it cold too.
Yeah.
In our basement, we're putting tile, and our Renos guy said, it's going to be cold.
Yeah.
And I'm like, great.
Mm-hmm.
And he's like, because I'm like, in the summer, I love to be in a cool space.
Yeah.
And he's like, yeah, but the winter. I'm like, we'll have a little electric fireplace, and that'll warm. My basement's not huge, so it'll do the trick.
Yeah.
Otherwise, a rug or throw on a cardigan is what I say.
Exactly. Yeah. It's easier to put layers on. You can only take so many layers off to get warm.
Yes.
Right? That's why I'm more of a fall, spring person than the summer. And people are like...
Jim, I'm shaking your hand right now. You can't hear this, but we're actually shaking our hands because I'm the same.
Yeah. I think I've seen a few Facebook memes of people, like a picture of Toronto in the winter, and people saying, if you can't complain about summer after seeing this. Right. I'm like, no, I prefer that winter to this summer.
Here's my thing, and I know our listeners have heard this before, but I'm going to say it again. When the temperature is such in the fall that I can walk out of the house with just a sweater on, I couldn't be happier.
Yeah. I get it.
And I look good in sweaters. I like the way I look. I don't look great in t-shirts, and I can't wear those, what do you call them, tankless?
Oh, the sleeveless t-shirts?
And that's nobody wants to see that.
No.
So, at least not on me. So, I'm always too hot and sweaty.
And you're Italian. You've got some hair happening on your arms. You have built-in insulation.
Listen, I certainly do. I certainly do. Yeah. So, Yeah. Okay, so you're going to alter your office for your child's room.
Yes. Well, that's one of the plans. We are still deciding on so many things, and not. We haven't made any solid decisions on anything.
What about baby names? Now, don't tell me if you have a baby name. I know you wouldn't, but has that come up in the conversation? Have you been bouncing around ideas?
That just came up.
Okay.
And so we've sort of figured out a couple of rules.
Okay. Can you share the rules with our listeners?
I think one of the rules is we don't want it to be too unique.
Okay.
We don't want Apple or those really stupid.
Muffin
and there's a certain amount that I'll accept, and I think there's sort of a sliding scale on this. But the one example that I brought up, and I hope this doesn't offend anybody, or this isn't somebody's name. Don't
mention it if you feel your spouse won't want you.
Oh, no. This is one that is on the no-fly list.
Okay.
And I don't know if you've ever seen this, but I've seen it a couple times. Is the name Nevea?
Okay.
And people use that name because Nevea is heaven spelled backwards.
Oh.
Right? And so people are like, oh, that's so beautiful. I'm like, that is just so corny. And I'm
See,
like,
I love that. I think that's wonderful.
yeah, no.
No, okay, so.
Yeah, I'm not about that.
Yeah, fair enough.
And then like standard names, like my wife's name is Jen, and she's like, that's a very common name, so
Yep.
she doesn't want anything too common. And then one of our friends recently passed away, and her name was Julie.
Mm-hmm.
And so we were thinking maybe Julie,
Oh.
but Julie Kim is like the most common Korean name for
Oh.
Korean English name. So we're like, we can't have that.
Okay.
And then the other one, and this might be a weird one, is
No, there's-
she can't have the initial CK.
CK, okay.
Yeah, so no Christine Kim
Okay.
or anything like that. And that's because of, and this might sound like almost like a stretch, but because of everything that happened with Louis C.K.
Oh, I see.
Yeah. So now that...
Well, that makes sense because you're in the world of comedy.
Yeah.
I respect that.
Yeah.
What about the name Mick? M-I-C.
That would make the baby sound like a McDonald's entree.
Okay. What about
Kim?
Midge? M-I-J.
Midge Kim?
Yeah.
That's like the backwards Jim.
That's right. That's what I did with both Mick and Jim to see. I wanted to test your theory of like these backwards things, if those would work for you.
That probably wouldn't fly.
Okay, fair enough.
Yeah.
Fair enough.
But we've also thought of like names that are genderless as well. So that's an option.
Gender-neutral names,
Yeah,
yeah.
gender-neutral names. So, I don't know.
like, okay,
Madison or
I
something
can
like
tell
that.
you a
Yeah.
bunch of gender neutral names because a lot of the work that I do
Okay.
when I do corporate work, because the role that I play could be played by a male or female
Oh, okay.
or someone who doesn't identify with a particular gender. We have these names that could be either gender, and so we have names like Leslie,
Okay.
Kim,
We can't have Kim.
right? Of course,
Yep.
because
Kim.
would be a little bit odd, but
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure there's Kims out there. Dale,
Okay.
Chris.
Yeah.
What are some other names that we use? I just said I had so many. Ashley.
Okay.
Yeah. Chris. I said Chris. Jean or Jean.
Oh.
Yeah. So there's these names that we use that come up all the time because they could be used by any actor who plays the role.
Jean would be good because that also fulfills my wish, and it's not a requirement,
Okay.
but it's a wish of having some nerd cred. So if it was if her name happened to be shared with a comic book
So
hero,
Jean Grey.
exactly.
Okay.
So
What
that
about Gray?
Gray Kim?
Like as a middle name. So let's say it was like, let's say you picked, what's a common name? Well, let's pick one of these gender neutral names,
Yes.
right? So that we don't identify. Leslie, Gray, Kim.
Well, that would be good, except I think we also already have
The middle name.
2 or 3 middle names
Oh,
already.
cool.
So I've been raised with the shortest legal name ever. Right. So to have like a 30-letter name, I think would just be cruel punishment for this child growing up
Sure.
and having to fill out application forms later on. So I'm trying to keep it as short as possible. So we'll see. I like the whole Marvel's way of using alliteration with the names.
Sure.
So like Christine or Carol, like that, the 2 hard C or K sounds, I really like, but I don't know if that's gonna fly because I think Jen is also afraid to have 2 Ks in a name.
Okay.
All it takes is one more, and
Yeah, fair enough.
Yes.
Fair enough. I'm not a huge fan of naming a child after a grandparent. Mm-hmm. And if you're named after a grandparent, or if this is what you did, more power to you.
Yep.
I'm only not a fan of it because my name was supposed to be my grandfather's name.
okay.
Because in tradition, in particular with my dad, who's from southern Italy, in tradition has it that you name your firstborn child after the grandparent. But my mom didn't like my grandfather's name and didn't want her son, myself, to be named after my grandfather.
Which is
Salvatore. Sal.
Yeah.
So she was like, no. And so for her, it was important to have a name that could sound good in both Italian and in English, or that she liked the sound of it in both languages.
Okay.
And so Marco won over Michael, which was her favorite name, her favorite English name. She likes how it sounds in English, which is Michael, but she wasn't such a big fan of how it sounded in Italian, Michele. She liked Michael, and she was like, the problem is when we have relatives or when we go to Italy, his name won't sound the way I want it to sound.
Yeah.
So
There's some good thought put into
she
that.
put a lot of thought into it. Yeah.
Well, and the one thing is, Korean tradition is that the eldest of the prior generation, so my dad is the eldest of his generation.
Okay.
He becomes the patriarch of the family and gives all of our kids their Korean name.
Oh, really?
Right, and that's all based on like a certain structure as well. So it's either a common prefix or a common suffix amongst that generation.
Amongst your dad's generation?
Every generation has one common either prefix or suffix.
Okay.
So for my generation, we had a common prefix, and it's G.
Okay.
So my Korean name is Ji Sung.
Okay.
My brother's is Ji Man, and et cetera,
Okay.
et cetera. So everybody in my generation has that. For our kids, so my grandfather named us.
Right, your grandfather did.
Yeah,
Okay.
and so my father is going to name our kids.
Right.
And they're all going to have the suffix of Shik.
Chic.
Yeah, so my nephew, his name is Hyun Shik.
That's his Korean name
That's his
given
Korean name.
by
my
your
dad.
uncle. Oh, by your dad.
By my dad, because he's the eldest of that generation.
Oh, so it's not even the grandfather of the child necessarily. It's the oldest in the lineage
It's the oldest.
'Cause
Of that generation.
of that generation.
Yeah. So technically, based on this, my older brother, who's the oldest of his generation, of my generation right now, will name
Your
our
child's-
grandkids.
Wow.
Yeah, and not, like all of the grandkids. So my brother's grandkids, my grandkids, technically my cousin's grandkids.
Really?
Like anybody who's a Kim will have their
in your family, because there's a lot of Kims out there.
Yeah, yeah.
Right? Wow, that's fascinating. Okay, so how is it determined the prefix or the suffix?
That I don't know, but I think it switches every generation to
So
from
it's
either
just
prefix or
it's
suffix.
just something that
Yeah.
gets known in the South Korean or the Korean community.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so, yeah, my dad's generation, everybody has the suffix of Kyung.
Okay.
So my dad's name is Tae Kyung, my uncle's Chun Kyung,
Wow.
et cetera, et cetera. So that's a pretty cool Korean thing.
That is a cool
Yeah.
Korean tradition.
Yeah. And so Jen is like, so I told Jen, I was just like, that doesn't have to go on the birth certificate.
Right.
That's just something like when the Korean relatives come.
Right,
That's
that's
what they'll. Yeah, yeah.
So who refers to you as Jae-sung? Did I
My
say right?
parents.
Ji-sung.
Ji-sung.
Ji-sung, sorry,
Yeah.
Ji-sung.
My parents and anybody who's Korean, like really Korean.
So they don't call you Jim, your parents?
No.
Oh, that's...
Yeah. So growing up, it was really confusing because if I was playing with my friends, they all knew me as Jim.
Of course.
But then if my mom's yelling at me from the front porch, she's yelling Ji-sung.
Right.
And so then my friends who I went to school with, but were my friends on my street, all thought my name was Jason.
Okay.
Right, and then they all went to a different elementary school, and then for middle school they came to my school, and when we shared the class, the teacher would be like Jim, and they'd be like, "Who's that?" And it would be me, and they were like, "No,
Wow.
his name is Jason." And I was like, "No, it's Jim technically." And they're like, "Why do your parents call you Jason?" And then I would have to explain to them the whole Korean thing, and then
Right.
of course, little Italian kids are like, "Your parents are weird."
Right.
Right.
Until you find out their traditions and whatnot.
Yeah.
Because my dad is named Bruno, but he would always tell a story of how when he came to Canada, people would try to call him Bruce because it was easier,
Oh.
but he hated the name Bruce, so he insisted they call him Bruno. And sometimes he would get into fights about it. And so he would always tell this story. So when I was in my mid-20s, as a joke, I started to call my dad Bruce. To which the reaction was he did not enjoy it at all, and he made it clear he didn't enjoy it. But the more he got angry, the more I would do it.
Yeah.
So much so that my sister started to call him Bruce, and my cousin started to call him Bruce. And every once in a while, my mother would refer to him when she was talking to us as Bruce. So where we would formerly call him Dad, we were now calling him Bruce. which is not his name, and it would
Yeah.
aggravate him. And at a certain point, he just sort of conceded, and we all called him Bruce. So friends who I met later on in life didn't think he was my father because I referred to him as Bruce. They thought maybe he was my stepfather or someone else because they didn't expect me to call my dad by
Yes.
his sort of anglicized first name. So that's a funny names. I find names so fascinating, and the things that you can do with names, and just the traditions with names as well.
Yeah. Well, people, every once in a while, I get an email, like a soliciting business email, and the person will start it off by saying, "Dear James," and that's an immediate delete. I'm like, you just tried to formalize my name, thinking that it would somehow make me feel better, but no. Oh, and one thing, I don't know if you've heard of this movie, but maybe it's something you should watch with your dad.
Sure.
It's a movie called They Call Me Bruce.
Right.
Have you heard of this?
I have.
Okay.
Wait, who's in it?
It's a Korean guy.
Okay, no.
No, it's an old 80s movie, and it's a Korean guy who comes to America, and he has a very difficult name, or it's not that he has a difficult name, is just because everybody he comes across thinks that because he's Asian, he knows martial arts, and he doesn't. But he fakes it, thinking that he can get away with it. And he's at the time he was like a well-known Korean comedian, but he looked exactly like my uncle, and I was convinced it was my uncle.
And what's your uncle's name?
My uncle's name is Chun Kyung.
Okay.
And so I was convinced it was him, and it looked exactly. And so when we saw it as a family, like we all I was the youngest one at the time, and so I thought it was him. It wasn't him, but
Wow.
yeah. But it's a terrible '80s movie. But if you want something to make fun of your dad with,
There you go.
that might be something.
Well, Jim Kim, Jae-sung,
Ji-sung. Yeah,
sorry.
that's okay.
Thank you. I never call you by your Korean name. Now
Yeah.
I'm going to try to learn it. Thank you so much for being on this episode.
Thank you for having me back.
We were going to talk about home renovations, and we got into names and
Yeah.
baby names.
Who knows?
Congratulations to you and to Jen.
Thank you.
We wish you all the best. And we'll have you back once the baby is born to talk about what's going on then.
Oh my God, that's going to be just me venting, I'm sure.
Not a problem. Well, thank you for listening. As always, the Insomnia Project is produced by Drumcast Productions, and this episode was recorded in Toronto, Canada.